Hello everyone. Today I will be featuring the USS Atlanta, which is of course the tier 7 premium that has been in the game for a very long time. This ship has often been on the list of ships that should receive buffs, because besides very few situational places where you can park behind an island and actually spam your shells, this ship tends to struggle, unless of course you're in a division, someone who smokes you up and so forth. Overall, the ship has always been questionable when it comes to competitiveness. It's always been fun, don't get me wrong. Some people often tend to confuse that, like, but the ship is so fun! Yes, I know, I also think the ship is very fun. But that doesn't change the fact that from a competitive view, it's always been a bit lacking. Now, fairly recently it's been receiving some nice buffs though. First of all, the radar fits it fairly well. I mean, it doesn't address the fundamental issue, which is that it doesn't quite have enough concealment to do what it does, and it really has no escapes because it's so slow, and if you get caught out it's also so squishy that you can't really angle against anything and you're gonna eat massive damage. So it's a highly positional cruiser, which makes it fairly challenging to play because, well, you have to be positioned correctly, and you have to, well, positioning is pretty much everything. Anything else is secondary when it comes to positioning. The radar makes it slightly better at hunting DDs, which is quite nice, but like ultimately close range it's still great against DDs with or without radar, and at long range it's still terrible against DDs with or without radar, because of course at long range the shell arcs become so insane that you can't actually hit the DDs if they know how to evade even a slight bit. However, it has received a good, nice buff in this patch, and well, it's received actually a bunch of buffs in the sense that it's significantly easier to have a decent Atlanta captain, because Concealment Expert became 1 point cheaper, and so it's much easier to get an AFT plus Concealment Expert captain now, which is of course quite nice. The big buff that it has received, however, wow, I popped defensive AA to shoot down the planes and the carrier strafes them. The big buff that it has, however, received is IFHE. And I mentioned it a couple of times. There are some ships who benefit greatly from it. I've made commentaries on them, like the Belfast and the Kutuzov, and there are some ships that don't really gain anything from them, which is pretty much most ships that shoot 203mm caliber shells or higher. They gain very little benefit from them at all. It might even be a negative impact on the gameplay to use the perk on those ships. Well, not only just a waste of perk points, but also you reduce your fire chance. The Atlanta, however, is one of those ships that definitively gain a benefit from this perk, because it allows the HE shells to do significantly more consistent damage. One of the major weaknesses of the Atlanta has of course been, unless you get broadside and are able to shoot AP, then the HE damage has been very underwhelming, and you've been at large at mercy of RNG, where you need those fires to proc and do damage before you can actually start dealing damage. However, with IFHE, you suddenly deal a lot of HE damage. You go from weak HE damage to pretty damn respectable, if not even scary HE damage. And that's of course quite fun on this ship, and it makes the ship more of a nightmare. Of course, on the flip side, this also ends up buffing the Flint, which isn't exactly needed. Anyone who has played the Flint knows just how ridiculous that ship is. That's pretty much what happens if they gave the Atlanta smoke. It would be straight up broken, which is why I understand they don't do it. But the Flint, of course, is a ridiculous ship because of the combination of IFHE and smokes makes the problem is with the smokes on the Flint, you no longer need to pay attention to any sort of positioning, and basically what I just said, the major weakness and the major challenge with the Atlanta is the positioning. Having smokes completely removes that need because, well, you can position anywhere, which makes life a lot easier. That's also one of the huge differences between, for example, Chapayev and Kutuzov. I consider both ships almost equal in strength when it comes to the capacity to win a game, but the Kutuzov is much easier to play because positioning doesn't matter because you have your smoke, whereas Chapayev is all about that positioning because you have no convenient barrier that can hide you from sight. Hiryu gets spotted in the open. Did you see how quickly that Hiryu melted? Even though I wasn't able to hit his broadside, but shells were raining on his deck, still doing heavy damage. Of course, the AA is still fantastic on the ship. I naturally run the IFHE to increase main gun range and anti-air range, and of course I run the module that increases AA range further, so you have a 7.2 km panic range on your AA, which is pretty much a must-have. Well, it's the most intelligent choice, really. There's no need to go for reduced dispersion because you spam so many shells anyway that you barely would even notice it. It's completely pointless. Here we have a good example though, a Myoko, which is known as a fairly well armored cruiser, and usually a ship, unless you got close and had AP, you might struggle against, but with IFHE, suddenly you don't need those fires to deal that damage. I mean, you still get a great amount of fires simply because you have such insane fire rate, but you can see the damage numbers that are popping up. I'm breaking his torpedo tubes. It's not just the fire that's terrifying now, it's the HE itself that has become a massive threat to pretty much all ships around you, and that's of course a fantastic, much needed add for the ship, because, well, in the open you can pretty much get wrecked by anyone else if they had any idea what they were doing. But now you can't just angle against an Atlanta and laugh at his HE, basically repair his fires after the fight is over, because now even when angling against an Atlanta he will do significant HE damage against you. And I like this because the ship needed this buff, and it was in dire need of some sort of increase, and IFHE just happens to fit that slot perfectly, where it increases a much needed part of the ship. So ultimately 0.6.0 I think has been a significant buff to the Atlanta, and a significant buff that it needed. Unfortunately, it has also been a buff for the Flint, which is something it really didn't need. And of course, it's also buffed a bunch of ships that, once again, I really didn't think needed buffs, like for example the Kutuzov and the Belfast. I thought both ships were very, very strong in their current states, and buffing them even further was not really needed. But I mean, if it means that one of the most fun ships in the game, the Atlanta, is more competitive now, I'll take it. I still wouldn't consider this ship OP by any means, because, well, it's still made of paper, it's still one of the slowest cruisers in the game, it still doesn't have a concealment good enough to compete with DDs. I mean, if you as a DD get ambushed by an Atlanta, you probably did a whole lot of things wrong, whether it was positioning or whatever else, but you shouldn't in general be ambushed by an Atlanta. So it's still not overpowered, but I'd say it's even more fun now, which is a good thing. I actually like it. I've been playing the Atlanta not just for the sake of getting a commentary, but simply because it's a fun ship now. Of course, it's even more terrifying against DDs, which amusingly it kind of didn't need, but especially Russian DDs that are known to being quite armored, especially when they angled against you, well, they just melt. They just completely melt. They melted before, but they melt even faster now. So the Atlanta really is a terrifying beast for DDs still. Of course, provided you catch them at close range. At long range, gunboat DDs can quite easily beat the Atlanta. In fact, some ships just straight up shit on the Atlanta. For example, the Akizuki has a huge advantage over the Atlanta for the simple reason that an Akizuki with stealth expert or concealment expert, sorry. An Akizuki with concealment expert can actually stealth fire from 9 km, and of course the Atlanta's concealment range is 9.1. So in an Akizuki you can sail around 9 to 9.1 in front of the Atlanta, and you can spam HE on him and you will be undetected because your stealth range is 8.9. So that matchup, for example, is heavily skewed in the favor of the Akizuki. But those are rare cases, and in general, of course, the Atlanta is a tier 7 premium, which is one of my most recommended ranges for premiums, because you usually get extremely favorable matchmaking, meaning you are up against tier 5 and tier 6 ships all the time. Carrier tries to drop me, it's a Cyclone, so the planes kind of popped out of nowhere. I still popped defensive AA and was managed to turn away to dodge the incoming torps. Got my Kraken there, and the game quickly ends after that. Pretty short game, honestly, but I'll take it. I got to say what I wanted to say, Interesting here now when we look at it though is, well, base XP, I shot down 22 planes, didn't really mention it, but everyone should know by now that the Atlanta is of course an AA god, especially with the build I run. You don't really need, I see people go with stuff like manual AA on the Atlanta, but you really don't need that. There's no point going manual AA on the Atlanta, that's a waste of points. Just get AFT, which also buffs your main guns. Manual AA is overkill, you already melt planes, you don't need additional plane melting. That's putting too many points into something that's already ridiculously strong. Here comes of course the interesting part, the detailed report. Now, well, the damage wasn't that impressive. I mean, 91k damage isn't exactly special for a T7 cruiser. However, the damage, the way it's dealt is quite interesting. In the past, of course, the vast majority of your damage came from fires, and you needed good RNG to get a lot of fires. You needed to shoot a lot of battleships and get a lot of fires, or maybe have a great torp run on some battleships to get that high damage. But now you can see that the HE damage itself is almost 70k. So a huge percentage. And fires, I didn't have the best RNG with fires, I only got 10 of them, but still it's a small percentage and it didn't really affect my damage at all. So very enjoyable change to the way the Atlanta plays. Anyway, I'll move on to my recommended build for this ship, and probably my recommended build for the Flint as well. Right, starting off, of course, premium repair. Not that important, but pretty useful. Premium radar I do recommend for the additional consumable. Defensive AA, the only reason to run premium is shorter cooldown, you have infinite amounts. Main armaments mod 1, you lose enough turrets without running this, please do run it. AA guns mod, none of the others are worth it, whereas the increased range is fantastic. Steering gears, you don't want to be losing that. And more steering gears, you saw the way I dodged torps, and well, dodge shells in general, that's why you wanted to get that good rudder shift. Captain perks wise, preventive maintenance, once again you don't want to be losing turrets or guns. Priority target, to know who and what is aiming at you, very useful. Adrenaline rush, you don't need last stand or expert marksman at all on this ship. Demolition expert for that fire chance. Concealment expert, AFT, and inertia fuse. Order of priority, I'd get probably priority target first. Because knowing who's shooting at you and how many are targeting you is probably the most important thing here. Adrenaline rush as the second, demolition expert followed up, and after that probably AFT first, and then concealment expert as soon as you can after AFT, because concealment expert isn't as important as positioning, hiding behind the islands. But finally inertia fuse second to last, and preventive maintenance as the very last perk. So that would be my recommended Atlanta build. Now if we're talking Flint builds, I largely go for the same, except maybe some changes around here, like I'd probably give up demolition expert for the sake of getting superintendent, for getting that additional smoke, because the smoke is so strong on the Flint, and it just gives it so much more freedom. Potentially I might even give up concealment expert on the Flint, because let's say you give up concealment expert, and that way you're able to get both demolition expert and superintendent, and then we give up, let's say, preventive maintenance, and we can get jack of, if I get both this, then I can give up preventive maintenance, and then I can get jack of all trades. So we give up concealment expert, but in return we have much shorter smoke duration, because once again Flint doesn't need concealment as much because of the smokes. Anyway, that was my Atlanta commentary. I hope you guys enjoyed it.